I think one of the interesting things about Mark Lewis is when I was talking about the idea of language, he was sort of, people kind of look at artist film video and say that it has to be non-narrative, and I think that that is often the case. That artist film video does not have a narrative, but I think that there is Mark's work is interesting because he introduces narrative in a way that that doesn't follow the kind of same structure as feature film, and actually the narrative in his work refers back to narrative that you find in painting, and this idea of narrative within a single image, which I think is something that people forget. It's like this kind of narrative is like this taboo in a way within artist film video. Often people want things to be to kind of step outside of that, but Mark's work is interesting in that it manages to do that in a way that that still has a kind of story within it. Mark tends to use a single roll of film for each of his works, and then it's kind of inspired partly by the way that in the early days of actuality film, people would shoot one roll of film, and that would be your film. You didn't have a kind of concept of editing. It's partly an homage to that in a kind of structure which is based on the material of 400 feet of 35mm film. And it's also a kind of economical decision which allows you to make a film without having to really pay for much editing time or much film stock, as a matter of fact. So this was actually shot in 35, or potentially, actually might have been Super 16, did it say at the start? So it's kind of hard to see, but there's a horse and rider in the distance there. That's really, when I'm talking about narrative, that's really all you're going to get. But they're tracing a trajectory across the screen, which is sort of, this linear structure. There we go. So here we have a narrative. It's a kind of a story of a journey. You have a place, which is, I think, the American desert, which is suggestive of a genre of cinema, the Western. It's inhabited by a man-made technology of the windmill. And there's this kind of confluence of themes which doesn't really merge into the story in the sense of like once upon a time this happened and then this happened. But it does sort of suggest the story in the way that a painting of a particular moment might do.
What is it about now which has led to this new vision, if you like, for the advice and even decide that they should appoint a person like you, and they should actually do. What is it about now which you think has kind of led to? Because it's a big change.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different factors at play in that scenario. I mean, some of them are, you could talk about cinema being in like a post-millennial moment where, in the early days of cinema, the forms of exhibition were quite loose, theorists like Raymond Boulor writes that the auditorium is just one form of installation, which was adopted so quickly it became institutionalized. But in the early days of cinema, you had other kind of options which were playing out on a regular basis. People inventing cinemas which took a variety of forms, and often like projecting film forward and then backward and upside down, stopping it on a frame. It was much more freeform in that time. You could say maybe that there's a return to that spirit, to some extent, after 100 years of cinema, through people asking, where do we go from here? You could also point to the fact that, there's this, urge that people have to make film. I'm not sure exactly what drives it, but I reckon it has something to do with, film being a kind of one-way medium, and you consume so much of it in your life, it's unavoidable that you have this urge to kind of take part in that conversation as a speaker, not just as a listener. So there's an acceleration of the consumption of film, which I think engenders people's desire to make their own. Or Turner Prize nominees being nominated from video work, there's like an institutional acceptance, which is just sort of, which is part of the linear progression that any media or any medium takes on its path from birth to true sophistication. I'm slightly skeptical of that theory, but I do think that a place like the BFI looks at looks at audiences for cultural film and video in galleries and probably says, you know, this is a medium whose time has come.